In the scorching heat of August 1990, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East fractured violently as Iraqi armored columns surged across the border into Kuwait. The international community watched in stunned silence as a massive military force seemingly dictated the region's future. Saddam Hussein possessed a staggering war machine, forged through 8 brutal years of conflict with Iran. A fourth-largest military in the world confidently believed the shifting desert sands would eventually bury the Americans, entirely unaware that the very night sky above them was about to betray their immense strategic ambitions. The Iraqi armed forces boasted over 1 million active personnel, thousands of Soviet-made heavy tanks, and a formidable artillery corps. Observers worldwide anticipated a grueling, protracted conflict characterized by massive casualties on both sides, heavily influenced by the grueling trench warfare tactics seen during the Iran-Iraq War. Western intelligence agencies expressed profound concerns regarding the potential death toll, fearing a devastating repetition of previous military quagmires. The prevailing conventional wisdom dictated that an offensive ground campaign against such entrenched defensive positions would inevitably result in rivers of blood soaking the arid Arabian Peninsula. Responding swiftly to this unprecedented aggression, the United States initiated Operation Desert Shield, deploying troops to Saudi Arabia to deter further expansion. General Norman Schwarzkopf assumed command of a rapidly growing coalition force, facing the monumental logistical challenge of transporting men and material across the globe. Despite the massive buildup of Allied military power, the shadow of the Vietnam War still lingered heavily over American strategic thinking. Politicians and citizens alike questioned whether the modern military apparatus could genuinely overcome a battle-hardened adversary without plunging the nation into another endless and tragic foreign conflict. Meanwhile, the Iraqi leadership meticulously fortified their defensive lines along the Kuwaiti and Saudi borders, constructing vast networks of trenches and berms. They deployed extensive minefields and constructed massive physical barriers designed specifically to funnel attacking enemy infantry into pre-sighted artillery kill zones. Saddam Hussein remained absolutely confident in his static defense strategy, believing that the harsh desert environment would inherently favor the entrenched defender. He publicly mocked the American forces, stating that they simply did not possess the stomach for a protracted ground war where thousands of soldiers would return home in body bags. However, this supreme confidence rested upon a fundamentally flawed understanding of how dramatically military technology had evolved over the preceding decade. The Iraqi generals prepared exclusively to fight a mechanized conflict reminiscent of the Second World War, focusing entirely on numerical superiority and brute armor strength. They failed to realize that the United States military had quietly undergone a revolutionary transformation, integrating advanced computer microprocessors and satellite communications directly into their weapon systems. A new paradigm of warfare was about to be unleashed, prioritizing absolute precision, electronic dominance, and overwhelming aerial supremacy over sheer numbers. At the heart of Iraq's defensive illusion stood Kari, a highly sophisticated, French-designed integrated air defense system connecting hundreds of radar stations. This network controlled thousands of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery pieces, establishing what appeared to be an impenetrable shield over Baghdad. Iraqi commanders monitored glowing radar scopes with intense pride, firmly believing that no foreign aircraft could ever penetrate their airspace without being immediately detected and destroyed. They genuinely thought their modernized capital city remained completely safe from any potential surprise attack originating from the vast skies above them. While the Iraqis dug deeper into the sand, the coalition forces finalized their meticulously planned logistical preparations in the Saudi Arabian desert. Huge stockpiles of advanced munitions, precision-guided bombs, and electronic warfare equipment arrived daily, transforming barren stretches of land into buzzing military hubs. Coalition aircraft flew relentless training missions, carefully testing equipment while remaining just outside the detection range of the Iraqi early warning radars. A palpable tension gripped the Allied aircrews as the United Nations mandated deadline for Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait rapidly approached without any visible sign of diplomatic resolution. Behind the scenes, American military planners prepared to unleash a closely guarded technological marvel that would completely shatter the enemy's illusions. The F-117 Nighthawk, an angular and bizarrely shaped aircraft, represented the absolute pinnacle of highly classified stealth technology development. Painted pitch black and completely devoid of any smooth curves, its unique faceted exterior was meticulously designed to scatter electromagnetic waves away from receiver antennas. These revolutionary machines sat quietly in heavily guarded hangars, their pilots studying detailed strike plans that would soon target the very nerve centers of the Iraqi military apparatus. The primary objective of the impending aerial campaign was precisely calculated to induce mass paralysis rather than mere physical destruction. By systematically targeting command bunkers, communication nodes, and radar installations, the coalition aimed to effectively decapitate the enemy leadership before ground troops ever engaged. General Schwarzkopf understood that blinding the adversary was the absolute prerequisite for an offensive strategy relying on speed and maneuverability. If the integrated defense network could be abruptly dismantled from above, the massive armored formations entrenched below would instantly become isolated, uncoordinated, and extremely vulnerable to precision attacks. As the critical January deadline inevitably expired, international diplomatic channels finally fell silent, signaling the unavoidable onset of open hostilities. Inside heavily fortified command centers, American generals calmly authorized the commencement of offensive operations, initiating a meticulously synchronized sequence of technological devastation. Far out in the dark waters of the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, heavily armed naval cruisers and destroyers silently opened their missile tube hatches. Deep inside the Saudi desert, the elusive stealth fighters began rolling out onto active runways, completely invisible to the watchful eyes of enemy early warning systems. The very first lethal blows were not delivered by traditional infantry assaults or massive artillery barrages, but by sophisticated computerized algorithms. Electronic warfare aircraft immediately flooded the Iraqi communication networks with overwhelming static interference, effectively severing the vital links between frontline units and high command. Powerful Tomahawk cruise missiles independently navigated across hundreds of miles, using advanced terrain-matching radar, silently skimming just above the unforgiving desert floor. A devastating technological storm was rapidly gathering momentum, poised to violently dismantle an enemy army still deeply entrenched in the outdated doctrines of the past. As midnight rapidly approached, the bustling city of Baghdad peacefully slept, firmly trusting its famously impenetrable radar network to provide absolute security. Anti-aircraft gunners relaxed near their seemingly invincible weapons, completely unaware that an entirely new era of warfare had already commenced above them. Black ghosts glided effortlessly across their sophisticated electronic screens without leaving a single trace or triggering a single alarm, hiding in plain sight. This raised a terrifying question that would soon be answered with immense destruction. What exactly is flying towards them through the darkness? On the moonless night of January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm officially began with an unprecedented display of technological supremacy. Deep inside Saudi Arabia, Specialized Task Force Normandy launched heavily armed Apache helicopters flying mere feet above the desert floor. Their specific mission involved destroying the crucial early warning radar sites positioned along the Iraqi border using highly advanced Hellfire missiles. Navigating through total darkness with cutting-edge infrared targeting systems, the elite pilots struck their targets with absolute precision. This critical initial strike tore a massive hole directly through the supposedly impenetrable Iraqi air defense network. Following the destruction of the border radars, the heavily fortified airspace over Baghdad lay completely exposed to the approaching invisible armada. The angular F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters slipped silently through the radar gaps, carrying highly destructive laser-guided payloads toward the Iraqi capital. On the ground, air defense operators stared in absolute confusion as their screens remained entirely blank, despite receiving scattered reports of incoming aircraft. By the time they realized the imminent danger, it was far too late to mount any coordinated defensive response against the phantom attackers. The heart of the military establishment was effectively defenseless. Suddenly, the quiet Baghdad night erupted into a blinding spectacle of fiery explosions and chaotic tracer fire streaking across the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries blindly fired thousands of glowing rounds upward, desperately hoping to hit targets they simply could not see or track. Above the chaotic barrage, the stealth pilots calmly utilized their sophisticated targeting pods to designate precise impact points on critical infrastructure buildings. Massive telecommunication towers and fortified command bunkers were instantly vaporized by perfectly placed munitions dropped from the invisible jets. The central nervous system of the Iraqi armed forces was methodically, systematically dismantled. Simultaneously, waves of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from naval vessels in the Persian Gulf slammed violently into electrical grids and governmental headquarters. These autonomous flying weapons navigated autonomously using advanced digital maps, correcting their flight paths by constantly scanning the terrain below them. For the first time in modern military history, missiles no longer fell blindly from the sky. They flew directly down the ventilation shafts of underground command bunkers, as if guided by the very eyes of death. This terrifying level of accuracy completely shattered the Iraqi leadership's confidence in their heavily fortified underground protection systems. Inside the surviving subterranean bunkers, high-ranking Iraqi generals experienced total sensory deprivation as their communication lines abruptly went dead. Cut off from their frontline units and unable to assess the rapidly deteriorating situation, command and control completely dissolved into absolute panic. General Norman Schwarzkopf's strategy of deliberate decapitation was working flawlessly, transforming a coordinated army into a chaotic mass of isolated battalions. Without functioning radios or working telephone networks, regional commanders could not coordinate counterattacks or even receive basic updates. The giant Iraqi military machine was effectively blinded and deafened within the first few hours. With the sophisticated integrated air defense network heavily crippled, conventional coalition aircraft quickly flooded into the newly opened airspace to continue the assault. Hundreds of heavily armed fighter bombers, including F-15 Eagles and British Tornadoes, systematically hunted down remaining radar installations and missile batteries. Electronic warfare jets accompanied these strike packages, actively jamming any surviving communication frequencies and neutralizing isolated surface-to-air missile sites. Whenever an Iraqi radar operator desperately attempted to activate their equipment, specialized anti-radiation missiles instantly traced the signal backward and destroyed the transmitter. The entire defensive umbrella collapsed rapidly under this overwhelming pressure. The Iraqi Air Force, once considered a formidable regional threat, proved entirely impotent against the technologically superior coalition aerial armada. Whenever enemy fighters desperately scrambled to intercept the attackers, American airborne warning and control system aircraft tracked their movements from hundreds of miles away. Coalition fighter pilots, equipped with advanced beyond visual range air-to-air missiles, easily destroyed the approaching Iraqi jets, long before they could even see their opponents. Realizing the complete futility of aerial combat, the Iraqi leadership ordered their remaining precious combat aircraft to simply remain hidden inside heavily reinforced concrete shelters. However, even the thickest concrete bunkers provided absolutely no sanctuary against the relentless onslaught of American precision-guided munitions. Coalition strike planners quickly adapted their tactics, equipping F-111 Aardvark bombers with massive 2,000-pound laser-guided bunker-busting bombs. These devastating weapons possessed hardened steel casings designed to penetrate deeply through layers of reinforced concrete before detonating their powerful explosive charges. Night after night, coalition aircrews systematically dismantled the Iraqi Air Force on the ground, permanently burying their modern fighter jets beneath thousands of tons of completely shattered concrete and twisted steel reinforcing bars. The continuous, methodical destruction of strategic targets exacted a massive psychological toll on the military personnel, desperately trying to survive the onslaught. Iraqi soldiers manning anti-aircraft guns quickly realized that turning on their targeting radars practically guaranteed an immediate and violently fatal response. A profound sense of complete helplessness spread throughout the ranks as they faced an enemy who could strike them with pinpoint accuracy at any moment. The terrifying realization that their technology was hopelessly outmatched paralyzed the defenders, stripping away their previously boastful confidence and replacing it with overwhelming dread and crippling fear. The global public witnessed this unprecedented technological warfare unfold in real time through groundbreaking live television broadcasts, broadcasting directly from Baghdad. Viewers around the world watched in sheer astonishment as precision bombs accurately struck their designated targets precisely as military briefers had described. The phrase collateral damage entered the common lexicon as the coalition heavily emphasized their unique ability to destroy military assets while minimizing civilian casualties. This televised display of absolute technological dominance sent a very clear and unmistakable message to potential adversaries worldwide regarding the unmatched capabilities of the modern American military machine. Sustaining this unprecedented aerial armada required an incredibly complex logistical ballet, taking place high above the clouds, far away from the frontline combat. Massive fleets of aerial refueling tankers continuously circled in designated safe zones, providing millions of gallons of aviation fuel to the thirsty strike fighters. Without this highly coordinated mid-air refueling capability, the short-ranged combat aircraft could never have reached their critical targets deep inside heavily defended Iraqi territory. This silent army of massive tanker aircraft served as the vital lifeblood that continuously powered the relentless American technological assault against the enemy forces. Simultaneously, highly sophisticated reconnaissance aircraft and orbiting military satellites tirelessly gathered crucial intelligence regarding the Iraqi troop movements and hidden defensive positions. Analysts in secure command centers meticulously examined highly detailed infrared imagery and intercepted radio transmissions to map the vast enemy trench networks. This continuous flow of precise information allowed coalition commanders to constantly adjust their targeting priorities, ensuring maximum disruption of the enemy's logistical supply chains. The Iraqi commanders, completely blinded by the destruction of their own radar systems, had absolutely no idea that their every move was being carefully monitored from above. As the intense aerial bombardment continued into its second week, the strategic focus slowly began shifting toward the massive Iraqi ground forces. General Schwarzkopf knew that while air power could paralyze the enemy's leadership, it could not physically force the occupying army out of Kuwait. The Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's most elite and heavily armored divisions, remained deeply entrenched in the unforgiving desert, still possessing thousands of operational tanks. These hardened combat veterans had survived years of brutal warfare and patiently waited in their heavily fortified positions for the anticipated coalition ground assault to finally begin. Despite the unprecedented devastation inflicted from above, the ultimate victory remained uncertain as the focus inevitably turned toward the looming ground offensive. The skies now completely belonged to the Americans. But down on the ground, 500,000 Iraqi soldiers were still desperately digging trenches, anticipating a bloody hand-to-hand conflict. Their colossal armored formations remained a deadly threat, heavily concealed beneath the shifting sands and protected by millions of buried landmines. Will bombs and missiles truly be enough to definitively subdue these massive steel armies waiting patiently on the unforgiving desert floor? Following the initial decapitation of Baghdad's command infrastructure, the coalition forces commenced a relentless 39-day aerial bombardment campaign, unlike anything witnessed in military history. The strategic focus systematically shifted away from urban political centers and directed its devastating fury toward the sprawling Iraqi military formations entrenched deep within the Kuwaiti desert. Having established absolute air supremacy, coalition commanders could now systematically dismantle the enemy's massive ground forces without facing any significant aerial opposition. The sky had transformed from a protective canopy into a terrifying realm dispensing continuous and inescapable destruction. At the forefront of this systematic annihilation was the formidable A-10 Thunderbolt, affectionately known by its pilots as the Warthog. This heavily armored, remarkably resilient aircraft was specifically designed during the Cold War to destroy massive Soviet tank formations in Europe. Flying dangerously low over the flat desert terrain, these ugly but incredibly lethal machines hunted the Iraqi armored columns with terrifying efficiency. Their massive 30mm rotary cannons fired depleted uranium armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could easily shred through the thickest steel plating of the heavily fortified Iraqi vehicles. The psychological impact of the Warthog's relentless attacks was profoundly devastating to the Iraqi frontline soldiers trapped in their static defensive positions. Long before they could even visually spot the approaching aircraft, they would hear the horrifying, unmistakable tearing sound of the massive rotary cannon firing its deadly payload. This terrifying noise became synonymous with impending doom, instantly shattering the morale of even the most battle-hardened veterans within the Republican Guard. The realization that their formidable tanks offered absolutely zero protection against this aerial onslaught completely paralyzed the defending forces. While the Warthogs ruled the daytime skies, the night belonged to the sophisticated F-111 Aardvark bombers, executing a revolutionary tactic nicknamed tank plinking. Equipped with advanced forward-looking infrared targeting systems, the weapon systems officers could clearly identify the heat signatures of Iraqi tanks against the cooling desert sand. The metal hulls of the armored vehicles retained the intense heat of the daytime sun, causing them to glow brightly on the infrared screens like illuminated beacons. The cover of darkness, which the Iraqi army desperately relied upon, had effectively been neutralized entirely. This immense technological disparity created a surreal and utterly terrifying battlefield experience for the Iraqi soldiers occupying the vast desert wasteland. How can you possibly fight back when your heavily armored, incredibly sturdy tank suddenly transforms into a blazing torch in the middle of the dark desert, completely without any preceding sound of an airplane engine to warn you? The precision-guided laser bombs, dropped from high altitude, struck with absolute, lethal accuracy, instantly vaporizing the heavy armored vehicles and instantly killing anyone unfortunate enough to be stationed inside or nearby. The once formidable Iraqi army, consisting of hundreds of thousands of combat-ready troops, found itself completely impotent against this invisible and relentless enemy. Their sophisticated anti-aircraft artillery was practically useless against high-altitude bombers, and turning on their targeting radars invited immediate destruction from anti-radiation missiles. Soldiers were forced to abandon their multi-million-dollar combat vehicles and desperately hide deep within the surrounding sand dunes, praying that the bombs would find another target. The greatest armored force in the Middle East was being systematically erased from existence. Beyond simply destroying armored vehicles, the continuous aerial campaign also completely severed the crucial supply lines sustaining the massive Iraqi occupation force. Coalition aircraft relentlessly bombed critical bridges, major highway intersections, and crucial ammunition depots, effectively starving the frontline troops of essential food, water, and vital replacement parts. Convoys attempting to resupply the besieged forces were quickly identified and instantly annihilated by roaming strike aircraft hunting for targets of opportunity. Within weeks, the heavily entrenched Iraqi soldiers found themselves dangerously isolated, rapidly running out of basic necessities and slowly losing hope. Complementing the physical destruction, the coalition initiated a massive psychological warfare campaign designed to further erode the collapsing Iraqi military morale. Aircraft dropped millions of informational leaflets over the enemy positions, explicitly warning them of impending bombing strikes and actively encouraging mass desertion. These carefully crafted messages detailed the overwhelming technological superiority of the coalition forces and promised safe treatment for anyone willing to lay down their weapons. Starving, terrified, and completely cut off from their command hierarchy, thousands of Iraqi soldiers began seriously contemplating the attractive prospect of peaceful surrender. Desperate to shift the overwhelming momentum of the conflict, Saddam Hussein ordered the launch of heavily modified Scud ballistic missiles toward civilian population centers. These notoriously inaccurate, obsolete Soviet-era weapons were fired blindly toward Israel and Saudi Arabia in a frantic attempt to provoke a broader regional conflict. The Iraqi dictator hoped that drawing Israel into the war would fundamentally fracture the fragile Arab coalition currently fighting alongside the United States military. However, this desperate political gamble ultimately failed, as intense diplomatic pressure successfully convinced the Israeli government to remain entirely neutral. To directly counter this terrifying ballistic missile threat, the United States deployed advanced Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries to protect Allied cities. These sophisticated defensive systems utilized highly complex computer algorithms to rapidly track the incoming Scuds and intercept them high within the Earth's atmosphere. While the actual interception success rate was heavily debated after the conflict, the spectacular nighttime explosions provided a massive psychological boost to the terrified civilian populations below. The deployment of defensive Patriot missiles perfectly highlighted the incredible breadth of American technological dominance over the Iraqi military. As the relentless 39-day aerial bombardment slowly reached its devastating conclusion, the Iraqi ground forces were merely a hollow shell of their former strength. Over half of their formidable armored vehicles were completely destroyed. Their logistical supply networks were entirely shattered, and the combat morale of their frontline troops was utterly broken. The coalition air forces had successfully achieved all of their strategic objectives, effectively neutralizing the enemy's ability to wage coordinated defensive warfare. However, wars are rarely won entirely from the sky, and a ground offensive was inevitable. The Allied air forces had successfully cleared the path, but the actual reality of the war ultimately had to be settled firmly on the ground. Deep inside his heavily guarded command center, General Schwarzkopf was intently looking at the topographical map of the barren western desert, an unforgiving wasteland where Iraq believed absolutely no army could ever successfully cross. He smiled quietly as he finalized the meticulous logistical preparations for his brilliant tactical maneuver. The greatest operational secret of the entire United States military was about to be violently unleashed. On the 24th of February 1991, the highly anticipated coalition ground offensive finally commenced under a shroud of absolute operational secrecy. General Norman Schwarzkopf brilliantly executed a massive flanking maneuver famously known as the left hook, completely bypassing the heavily fortified Kuwaiti border defenses. He commanded a colossal force of hundreds of thousands of coalition troops and heavily armored vehicles to secretly shift hundreds of miles westward into the featureless Saudi desert. The Iraqi high command remained entirely oblivious to this massive logistical repositioning, firmly believing the harsh terrain was completely impassable for any modern mechanized army. The crucial technological key to executing this audacious desert maneuver was the newly deployed Global Positioning System, a revolutionary satellite navigation network. Previously, navigating the vast and featureless Arabian desert required traditional compasses and physical landmarks, making massive coordinated troop movements practically impossible. However, coalition commanders now possess small electronic receivers that communicated with orbiting satellites to pinpoint their exact geographical coordinates within meters. This incredible technological advantage allowed massive armored columns to move precisely through the blinding sandstorms and pitch-black nights, confidently carving a devastating path toward the extremely vulnerable western flank of the Iraqi army. Moving with unprecedented speed and synchronized precision, the heavily armored coalition forces surged across the barren landscape like an unstoppable mechanical tidal wave. Thousands of M1 Abrams main battle tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles aggressively tore through the sand, completely undetected by the blinded Iraqi intelligence network. Logistical supply trucks followed closely behind, carrying millions of gallons of fuel and massive quantities of ammunition required to sustain this rapid armored advance. This incredible logistical achievement practically guaranteed that the frontline combat units would never pause their relentless momentum as they drove deeper into hostile territory to trap the enemy. As the American armored spearhead rapidly approached the elite Republican Guard divisions, nature itself unleashed a massive and terrifying obstacle. A violent desert sandstorm suddenly engulfed the entire battlefield, drastically reducing visual visibility to practically zero and grounding all coalition air support operations. The deeply entrenched Iraqi commanders briefly rejoiced, genuinely believing that the blinding sand and fierce winds would effectively halt the American advance and protect their vulnerable armor. In the worst sandstorm of the entire decade, the Iraqi forces foolishly thought that nature was actively protecting them, completely unaware of the lethal technology rapidly approaching their positions. On the 26th of February, the heavily armored 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment aggressively navigated through the howling sandstorm toward a designated map coordinate known simply as 73 Easting, Captain H.R. App. McMaster decisively commanded Eagle Troop, a relatively small but highly lethal formation of 9 heavily armored M1 Abrams tanks and 12 Bradley fighting vehicles. Peering intently through his advanced thermal imaging sight, McMaster suddenly detected a massive formation of hidden Iraqi T-72 tanks heavily entrenched just ahead. Without a moment of hesitation, he loudly commanded his armored unit to immediately attack the superior enemy force hidden within the storm. The technological disparity between the two clashing armies became violently apparent within the very first few seconds of this brutal armored engagement. Through the advanced thermal imaging lenses of the American tank gunners, the pitch-black night and blinding sandstorm appeared merely as a highly transparent window. The heavily armored Iraqi T-72 tanks, with their massive engines emitting intense heat signatures, glowed remarkably bright white against the cool background of the surrounding desert sand. The American gunners possessed the incredible ability to clearly identify and accurately target enemy armor long before the Iraqi soldiers even realized they were under attack. Firing their devastating depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds, the American Abrams tanks systematically annihilated the dug in Iraqi armored positions from incredibly long distances. A heavy kinetic energy penetrator completely ignores thick steel armor, slicing through the heavy enemy tanks and instantly igniting the highly volatile ammunition stored inside. Massive fiery explosions violently erupted through the blinding sandstorm as the pride of the Iraqi Republican Guard was systematically reduced to scattered burning wreckage. The terrified Iraqi gunners blindly fired their weapons into the raging sandstorm, desperately hoping to hit an invisible enemy that was systematically destroying their entire defensive line. The chaotic battlefield was completely filled with the deafening roar of massive tank engines and the terrifying shrieks of incoming hypervelocity anti-tank rounds. Captain McMaster aggressively pushed his armored formation forward, rapidly destroying multiple enemy vehicles while continuously coordinating heavy suppressive fire over the tactical radio network. "Keep pushing forward. Do not give them any time to recover or organize a defense," he loudly commanded his highly disciplined tank crews through the heavy static of the communication system. The American armored advance was incredibly swift and violently decisive, leaving absolutely no room for any coordinated Iraqi tactical counterattack. In less than 30 minutes of extremely intense combat, the heavily outnumbered American cavalry troop completely obliterated an entire brigade of the elite Republican Guard. The Iraqi forces, widely considered to be among the most formidable combat veterans in the entire Middle East, were entirely defenseless against this modern weaponry. Their outdated Soviet-era optical gun sights were completely useless in the raging sandstorm, entirely blinding them to the rapid approach of the technologically superior American armor. It was an absolute mechanical slaughter that perfectly demonstrated the terrifying and overwhelming reality of advanced late 20th century technological warfare. News of this devastating and completely lopsided armored defeat spread rapidly throughout the surviving units of the terrified Iraqi Republican Guard divisions. The profound psychological shock of seeing their most heavily fortified defensive positions completely vaporized by an invisible enemy completely broke their collective fighting spirit. Entire armored battalions simultaneously abandoned their highly expensive combat vehicles, desperately waving makeshift white flags as the massive American armored columns rapidly approached their crumbling defensive lines. The once mighty army of Saddam Hussein, which had aggressively threatened to drown the coalition in rivers of blood, was now rapidly disintegrating into absolute chaotic panic. Meanwhile, along the heavily fortified Kuwaiti coastline, coalition amphibious forces executed a brilliant series of deceptive feints that completely paralyzed the Iraqi coastal defenders. Firmly believing that a massive marine landing was imminent, several Iraqi combat divisions remained completely stationary, stubbornly facing the Persian Gulf while their western flank collapsed. When they finally realized the true direction of the overwhelming American assault, thousands of terrified Iraqi soldiers scrambled desperately to escape the rapidly closing military trap. The heavily congested highways leading back to the Iraqi border quickly became completely jammed with retreating military vehicles and frantic fleeing combat personnel. The formidable Republican Guard, the absolute pride and joy of Saddam Hussein's military machine, had been violently crushed into the desert sand in a single afternoon. The massive armored left hook had worked absolutely perfectly, completely outmaneuvering and technologically overwhelming a vastly larger static enemy defensive force. Now, the open highway leading directly toward the Iraqi capital city was practically undefended, and the ticking countdown clock of this incredibly brief war began striking its final seconds. Can the completely shattered Iraqi leadership possibly salvage anything from this catastrophic technological defeat before the coalition forces reach the very gates of Baghdad? As the devastating American armored columns continuously advanced toward the Iraqi capital city, the terrifying reality of the technological slaughter finally broke the enemy's will. Hundreds of thousands of exhausted Iraqi soldiers simultaneously abandoned their fortified defensive positions and surrendered to the rapidly approaching coalition forces. The massive desert highways were completely filled with retreating infantrymen, desperately begging for immediate medical assistance and basic food rations. It was an unprecedented military collapse, vividly demonstrating that absolute technological supremacy completely neutralizes massive numerical advantages in modern combat. The highly anticipated mother of all battles, proudly promised by Saddam Hussein, had rapidly transformed into a chaotic and humiliating mass retreat. Coalition Apache attack helicopters systematically hunted down the fleeing Republican Guard convoys along the infamous Highway of Death leading directly out of Kuwait. Thousands of stolen civilian vehicles and heavily armored military transports were brutally destroyed by precision-guided laser missiles fired from above. The completely decimated Iraqi army was hopelessly trapped in a terrifying bottleneck of burning wreckage and twisted steel armor. Observing the absolute devastation inflicted upon the retreating Iraqi military forces, American political leadership quickly decided to halt the offensive operations. Exactly 100 hours after the massive ground invasion had officially commenced, President George H.W. Bush formally declared a comprehensive ceasefire agreement. The previously formidable Iraqi war machine, which had aggressively terrorized the entire Middle East region just months earlier, was now completely paralyzed and systematically disarmed. The shockingly brief duration of the ground war completely shattered all prior international military expectations and historical precedents. This incredibly swift military victory permanently erased the lingering psychological trauma of the Vietnam War from the collective American consciousness. The United States military definitively proved that their revolutionary doctrine of overwhelming technological superiority could easily secure decisive victories with astonishingly minimal Allied casualties. International defense analysts and military historians scrambled to completely rewrite their strategic textbooks, quickly realizing that the fundamental nature of human conflict had drastically changed forever. The outdated concept of fighting prolonged wars of attrition with massive infantry armies was officially declared completely obsolete. The brilliant tactical integration of stealth fighter aircraft, advanced satellite navigation networks, and precision-guided munitions fundamentally transformed the entire global battlefield. Traditional geographical obstacles like blinding desert sandstorms or absolute darkness were no longer reliable defensive shields against a technologically advanced military adversary. The incredibly accurate infrared targeting sensors and advanced thermal imaging cameras allowed coalition forces to clearly observe and efficiently destroy hidden targets with absolute impunity. The frightening era of surgical strikes and highly digitized information warfare had violently announced its undisputed arrival. In the immediate aftermath of this incredibly lopsided conflict, military generals across the globe nervously evaluated their own defensive capabilities. Nations relying heavily on massive standing armies equipped with outdated Soviet-era technology suddenly realized they were completely defenseless against modern American military innovations. The shocking realization that thousands of heavily armored tanks could be systematically vaporized by invisible aircraft drastically altered international defense spending priorities. Global military budgets rapidly shifted away from expanding infantry divisions toward actively acquiring sophisticated computerized weapon systems and advanced electronic warfare capabilities. General Norman Schwarzkopf instantly became an internationally celebrated military hero, widely praised for his masterful execution of the incredibly complex Desert Offensive. During a widely broadcast press conference, he calmly explained the overwhelming success of the massive flanking maneuver that completely decimated the enemy. We successfully blinded them, we systematically deafened them, and then we rapidly outflanked their heavily fortified static defenses before they could even react, the confident general proudly stated to the gathered international journalists. His brilliant tactical strategy became an undisputed masterpiece of modern military operational art. Despite the overwhelming military triumph, the political aftermath of the brief desert conflict established extremely complex geopolitical challenges for the region. Saddam Hussein remained securely in power within Baghdad, ruthlessly suppressing internal domestic rebellions despite his catastrophic and extremely humiliating military defeat in Kuwait. The massive destruction of Iraqi national infrastructure subsequently led to a prolonged humanitarian crisis severely exacerbated by strict international economic sanctions. The seemingly decisive American military victory unfortunately planted the volatile seeds for future devastating conflicts that would eventually consume the region again. The unprecedented global media coverage of the conflict drastically altered how civilian populations perceived the brutal reality of modern international warfare. Continuous live television broadcasts featuring spectacular nighttime missile interceptions and perfectly accurate laser-guided bomb strikes created an incredibly sanitized illusion of combat. Audiences completely insulated from the horrific carnage occurring on the distant desert battlefield easily consumed the terrifying destruction purely as an impressive technological spectacle. This dangerous media phenomenon heavily influenced public opinions regarding the perceived ease and inherent morality of future military interventions abroad. Technological development within the defense industry rapidly accelerated following the highly successful combat debut of these sophisticated computerized weapon systems. The incredible operational success of the global positioning system during the massive ground offensive practically guaranteed its rapid integration into civilian commercial applications worldwide. Countless military innovations originally designed strictly to violently destroy enemy infrastructure eventually transformed fundamental aspects of peaceful modern human existence. The terrifying tools of absolute destruction ironically helped establish the foundational technological architecture of the heavily interconnected modern global society we inhabit today. Looking back at the historical legacy of the incredibly swift campaign, military scholars continually emphasize its profound transformational impact on modern strategy. Operation Desert Storm definitively proved that establishing absolute dominance in the electromagnetic spectrum is absolutely essential for achieving a decisive battlefield victory. By completely controlling the vital flow of digital information, a smaller and highly advanced military force can easily paralyze and completely dismantle a vastly larger opponent. This fundamental tactical principle continues to heavily dictate the modern strategic doctrines of all major international military superpowers. The incredibly precise deployment of long-range cruise missiles during the brief conflict completely revolutionized the traditional concept of strategic naval bombardment. Heavily armed battleships and advanced submarines effectively projected devastating military power hundreds of miles inland without ever directly exposing their valuable human crews to enemy fire. This unprecedented capability to systematically destroy highly fortified land targets from the relative safety of the distant ocean profoundly altered global naval strategies. Controlling the international waterways now effectively meant possessing the terrifying ability to strike deeply into the heart of any adversarial nation. The sheer logistical mastery demonstrated by the coalition forces during the rapid offensive remained an unprecedented miracle of modern military planning. Supplying hundreds of thirsty armored vehicles charging across the barren desert required an incredibly complex network of dedicated transport trucks and massive fuel depots. Thousands of dedicated supply personnel worked tirelessly around the clock to ensure the frontline combat units possessed the essential ammunition required to sustain their relentless momentum. This incredible unseen effort fundamentally proved that technological supremacy relies heavily upon an incredibly robust and highly efficient logistical foundation. The massive environmental devastation caused by the retreating Iraqi forces added a deeply tragic dimension to the incredibly swift military conclusion. Desperately seeking a final act of bitter vengeance, Iraqi engineers deliberately ignited hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells, creating a massive apocalyptic inferno. Thick black smoke completely blocked out the sun, turning the bright desert daytime into a terrifying pitch-black nightmare, while highly toxic rain fell upon the returning civilian population. This spiteful act of deliberate ecological terrorism served as a grim reminder of the horrific consequences of absolute desperation. The massive desert storm has finally cleared, leaving behind a heavily scarred landscape and fundamentally altered global strategic paradigms that will remain forever. The entire world was forced to violently realize an incredibly frightening and absolute truth regarding the terrifying future of armed human conflict. Massive infantry, manpower, and traditional conventional weapons are completely meaningless against the overwhelming precision of advanced microchips and orbiting communication satellites. The chaotic and bloody battlefields of the past have officially transitioned into the highly digitized and terrifyingly efficient era of modern computerized warfare.